The message arrived at 8:11 in the evening, right as I was scraping the last of a reheated casserole from a chipped plate and debating whether the effort had been worth it. Crash at Mara's place tonight. Don't wait up. The words were tidy, efficient, and carried the same emotional weight as a reminder about trash day. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, letting the blue light stain my thumb while the kitchen clock clicked through a full minute. My wife had started doing this more often over the past season, these sudden overnights with her old university friend, as if adulthood still ran on dorm room schedules. We were both 34, both exhausted, both claiming our jobs were eating us alive, so I told myself this was just her way of breathing. I typed back something supportive and neutral, then rinsed the plate and left it to dry, but the quiet that followed felt too deliberate, like a stage set after the actors had rushed off. She'd come in less than half an hour earlier, swapped her blazer for a sweater, slid a small bag off the closet shelf, kissed my cheek with distracted lips, and said she'd explain later. No story over coffee that morning, no hint during the afternoon, just a practiced exit. I tried to drown the unease with a streaming show, but every laugh track landed wrong, and by the time the credits rolled I was counting the ways this night differed from the last few. At a little after 10, I called her out of habit and got the soft, bureaucratic voice of voicemail. I told myself her phone was probably dead. She treated chargers like optional accessories. But curiosity, that slow-burning itch, pushed me to look up Mara's number. We'd hosted her twice loud dinners with too much wine and stories that trailed into the early hours. The line rang, and when she answered, her greeting carried the hollow acoustics of a room that didn't expect company. I asked if my wife was around, just to pass along something trivial. The pause stretched. Then came confusion, not the playful kind. She said she hadn't seen her in weeks, that they'd penciled in lunch for a date far ahead, that tonight was news to her. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat there while the living room hummed with appliances. I reread the text, the simple sentence that now felt like a door bolted shut from the other side. A collage assembled itself in my head. The new scent she wore that wasn't mine, the way her phone slept face down at dinner, the late meetings that kept multiplying like rabbits. When I called again, I left a message that tried to sound casual and failed. Then, because trust had apparently turned into a luxury item, I logged into our shared account and watched the past 8 weeks arrange themselves into a map I hadn't known I was following. Numbers I didn't recognize, calls that stretched long into nights I'd believed were quiet, a single contact that appeared with mechanical regularity. I dialed it, listened to a man's puzzled hello, apologized, and hung up with my heart in my throat. The show kept playing to an empty audience, and I understood with a clarity that felt like ice that she wasn't at any friend's apartment. She was somewhere else with someone else. And tomorrow she would come home and tell me a story with the same calm efficiency as that text, and it would land on a table already crowded with lies. I didn't sleep, not really. I floated between shallow dreams and the glow of the hallway clock until morning pressed against the windows like a curious neighbor. When I finally stood up, the house had the sterile quiet of a place that had been cleaned of meaning. Her accounts were still open on the shared computer because she trusted my disinterest more than any password, and that trust felt almost tender now, like a relic from another life. The inbox looked innocent until I checked the digital trash and found reservations that had been carefully thrown away. 3 different hotels over 5 weeks, each booking for 2, each date aligned with a story I'd already swallowed. I saved copies under a dull folder name that would never invite attention. Her social feeds told a brighter story, selfies, coffee cups, sunsets, but the locations didn't match the hours she'd sworn were chained to meetings. The photo backup told the rest, careless and exhaustive. Candlelit tables, glasses beaded with condensation on rooftops, a weekend somewhere green she'd told me didn't exist, and in the margins of the frames the persistent evidence of a second presence, an arm, a reflection, a shadow that refused to disappear. A text arrived while I was scrolling, breezy and affectionate, apologizing for an early night and promising she'd be back soon. I answered with the language of peace and kept digging. The card statements were a ledger of secrets. Boutiques I'd never visited with her, dinners priced for two, fuel bought on the wrong side of town. The thread I finally uncovered had been disguised with a name that belonged in a meeting room, not a bedroom, and it was written in a shorthand of confidence and contempt. Plans, reassurances, timelines, jokes about how easily I was managed. There was talk of patience, of waiting out some minimum number of weeks before making things official, of lawyers and logistics, of using familiar names as camouflage. By the time she called to ask if I wanted coffee on her way back, my voice had learned to behave like it always had. I said yes, because I needed 20 minutes to become an actor in my own house. I printed what mattered, hid it where I hid nothing else, erased my tracks, and practiced a face that could pass for unbroken. When she came in with paper cups and a smile that fit her like a well-worn coat, she asked about my night and offered a story about comfort and conversation that had never happened. I nodded and told her she should do it more often. Surprise flickered and died in her eyes. While the shower ran, I made lists that were not about groceries, moved numbers that were not about budgeting, and scheduled things that were not about convenience. When she left again, promising another late obligation, I watched the driveway empty and understood that whatever we'd been calling a marriage had already become a long, careful performance, and I was done applauding. The days that followed felt like living inside a carefully rehearsed illusion where I knew every trapdoor and still had to hit my marks. She moved through the house with the same easy choreography, suggesting errands, floating ideas about trips we should plan, even laughing at a joke about how predictable our routines had become, and each word landed on me like a paper cut. Every morning after she left, I converted that quiet into logistics. A stack of documents slipped into a box, a watch that had belonged to my grandfather wrapped in a scarf, old albums that smelled like dust in summers. All of it driven across town to my brother's garage, where it could sit like a time capsule waiting for a safer era. Midweek she announced another overnight with the same casual authority she used to choose a cereal, adding a little story about a friend's career wobble that needed support, and I told her to pass along my regards because the words were easier than the truth. When she pulled out of the driveway, I followed a different map and parked across from a low, glassy hotel that pretended to be modest and failed. Her car was there, angled under a light that made the paint look paler than it was. I didn't go in. I took a photograph that could speak when I wouldn't and drove home to wait. The next evening arrived right on schedule with another work thing. And 30 minutes after she left, a man with a toolbox turned the tumblers on my front door into strangers. While he worked, I packed a selection of her life into neat boxes, enough to be unmistakable, not enough to be cruel, and stacked them where they would interrupt any story she planned to tell herself. When the keys changed hands, the house exhaled. I sat at the computer and wrote a letter that refused to be poetic, a catalog of dates and charges and conversations, a timeline that left no room for imagination, and I ended it with arithmetic, not sentiment. Before midnight, I called the same friend whose name had been doing so much work for her, and learned she hadn't been in town all week. That was the last piece I needed. I left the letter where it would be found, loaded what was mine into the car, and checked into a place that smelled like detergent and anonymity. My phone began to vibrate like an insect trapped under glass, and I turned it face down and slept without dreams. Morning felt like a clean floor. When I turned the phone back on, the story told itself in missed calls and messages that moved from casual to confused to terrified in a matter of hours. I answered one unknown number because curiosity still had some authority over me, and heard her voice try to find a register that would open a door I'd already closed. She wanted explanations. I wanted accuracy. I told her about the reservations she'd buried, the thread she'd mislabeled, the arithmetic she'd assumed I'd never learn, and the friend she'd drafted without consent. When she asked where I was, I said somewhere that had finally learned to be quiet. I called a lawyer whose reputation was built on not being impressed, and he was not. He asked for evidence. I sent it. He asked for patience. I gave him what I could spare. He told me that in our state, deception had a way of becoming expensive, especially when it wore receipts like a sash. Meanwhile, she tried new numbers, new tones, new appeals, and each one sounded like a language I no longer spoke. On a gray afternoon, I drove past the old house and saw her sitting on the steps, smaller than the version of her that had filled rooms, arguing with someone who wasn't there. The friend she'd borrowed as a mask called me later, angry at being conscripted into a fiction and relieved to be free of it, and promised not to hold up any more scenery. That night, I waited near her office and watched her hurry into a dark sedan driven by a man who wore confidence like a tailored jacket. I didn't need to follow far. The restaurant was already familiar from the ledger. The photos were clean, the timestamps honest, and the ring on his hand did more work than any caption. By the time I sent the package to an address pulled from a public directory, I felt less like an avenger and more like a clerk delivering overdue mail. The note was brief. The truth rarely needs decoration. By the following week, consequences began arriving like weather, first as a pressure change you could ignore, and then as a downpour you couldn't. My attorney called with the tone he used when numbers had finally started to behave. The other side had filed something bland and optimistic. Hopping the word differences could do the work of a confession, and he was already drafting a reply that spoke in plainer terms. Evidence has gravity, he said, and this much of it tends to pull outcomes in predictable directions. Messages kept finding their way to me anyway, borrowed phones and borrowed sympathy, and I kept answering with the same sentence until it felt like a mantra. Talk to my lawyer. One afternoon, a woman I'd never met before sat across from me in a cafe that smelled like burnt espresso and bravery. She placed a folder between us like a truce offering and introduced herself as the person who had finally decided to stop being careful. She had been counting for months, she said, and my wife had been the most expensive item on her husband's ledger. The pages were a second map, one that overlapped mine so neatly it was hard not to admire the symmetry. Gifts that arrived when I thought overtime was happening, flights booked under innocuous pretexts, a weekend lease in a city that wasn't ours. There were messages, too, full of geography and ambition, a plan to move west and pretend that reinvention was the same thing as amnesia. It wasn't just betrayal, it was coordination, and coordination leaves paperwork. When she asked what I wanted to do, I said I wanted the truth to cost exactly what it should. She nodded like someone who had already paid an admission fee and wasn't interested in refunds. The workplace found out in the way workplaces always do, through whispers that turn into memos, and by the end of the month both of them were discovering how quickly policy can become personal. Administrative leave is a phrase that sounds like a nap and feels like a fall. Mediation was suggested with the optimism of people who sell umbrellas during storms, and my attorney laid the numbers out without adjectives. A split that favored me, fees that wouldn't be mine, and a promise of silence that could be enforced. The alternative, he said, was a courtroom where timelines grow teeth. The friend she'd tried to recruit called again to say she'd been offered money to remember things differently and had declined, offended on principle. I thanked her and meant it. On a quiet morning, the other spouse texted to say her case was moving fast, that the ring I'd photographed had not been an ornament, and that sometimes the fastest way to end a story is to let two lawyers compare notes. I went for a long walk and noticed, for the first time in weeks, that my shoulders weren't trying to meet my ears. Months later, the papers were final and the house felt like a place again instead of a stage. She took the deal because arithmetic, when it stops being theoretical, can be persuasive. The city she'd chosen as a horizon receded into something like a rumor, and the job that had lent her confidence learned to prefer quiet. I kept what I'd built, and a little more than half of what we'd built together. And I kept the habit of not believing stories that arrive without timestamps. I bought a car with money that didn't feel cursed and took a trip I'd been postponing for reasons that no longer existed. The friend who had been drafted into fiction once told me she'd seen my former wife in a grocery aisle, rehearsing a version of events that no one had asked to hear, and had answered with the only sentence that mattered. I don't know what became of the man with the tailored confidence, and it turns out I don't need to. The best surprise was how ordinary peace can be when it finally has the room to be. The season turned without asking permission, and I learned how many small habits are really just agreements with someone who isn't there anymore. The house needed fewer groceries, the sink learned to stay empty, and silence stopped feeling like a verdict and started feeling like a room I could rearrange. There were hearings that resembled choreography more than conflict, and signatures that looked ordinary until you realized how much history they were willing to outlive. I discovered that evidence has a half-life in the imagination but a permanent address in a file cabinet, and I kept copies not because I wanted to revisit them, but because forgetting is a luxury best purchased, not assumed. Some afternoons I'd catch myself rehearsing conversations that no longer had a stage, and I'd laugh at the way the mind tries to preserve a museum of broken exhibits. Friends took turns inviting me to things that involved chairs and sunlight, and I said yes often enough to remember that I hadn't been drafted into a witness protection program. Money became quieter, too. It stopped arriving with explanations attached, stopped leaving in disguise. The legal language did its work and then receded, like scaffolding around a building that had finally remembered what it was supposed to be. I kept the letter I'd written, not to reread, but to remember the day I decided that accuracy was kinder than hope. There were nights when I still woke up with the reflex to check a phone that had nothing left to report, and mornings when the coffee tasted better simply because no one had a story to sell with it. The map of my routines changed, but the compass stayed put. When people asked what I'd learned, I said that trust is a practice, not a credential, and that the body knows the difference long before the calendar does. They nodded, as people do when they recognize a sentence that isn't asking to be argued with. Time, it turns out, is a patient editor. It cuts whole chapters without asking, leaves margins where you expected footnotes, and insists that you reread the passages you wanted to skip until they sound like your own voice again. I painted a room the color of a morning that doesn't rush you, and filled it with books that had nothing to prove. I took long walks with no destination and shorter ones with excellent bread at the end. Occasionally, a rumor would drift across my path like pollen, and I'd remember how narratives travel when they're trying to survive, but I didn't chase them. The version of me that needed to correct every record had retired. I learned to be interested in weather and patient with appointments, to plan trips that didn't require cover stories, to say no without a footnote. There's a particular relief in realizing you're no longer an extra in someone else's plot. When I finally invited someone new to dinner, it felt less like a test and more like a Tuesday, which was exactly right. We talked about work and music and the stubbornness of good bread, and I noticed that I wasn't performing an absence. I was present. If there's a moral that fits in a pocket, it's this: consequences don't need to be theatrical to be complete, and peace doesn't announce itself with a drum roll. It just shows up one morning, sits at your table, and asks what you're doing with the rest of the day. I kept expecting some final cinematic moment, a door slammed or a speech delivered in rain, but endings rarely audition for their roles. They arrive like receipts you find in a pocket months later and realize you don't need to keep. The files went into a box that went onto a shelf that slowly became background architecture, and with that small act the story stopped demanding to be rehearsed. Work found a new rhythm, friends found new excuses, and the city proved it could be generous without witnesses. I learned to cook for one without cooking for loneliness, to buy tickets without checking calendars that no longer applied, to leave lights on because I liked the way they made the windows look from the street. Once, on a train, I caught my reflection in the glass and didn't recognize the posture, which was straighter and less defensive, and it felt like meeting someone who'd been living in my spare room all along. There were still questions that floated by like leaves, but I stopped stepping into the river to chase them. Justice, when it's done with you, doesn't ask for applause, it asks for upkeep. So I maintained small rituals that had nothing to do with recovery and everything to do with continuity, Sunday bread, Tuesday calls to my brother, a book that refused to be summarized. When people hinted at what had happened, I answered with weather. The past doesn't need a tour guide, and the future doesn't benefit from a map that pretends it's a verdict. The only thing I carried forward on purpose was the habit of checking my own pockets before I accused the day of theft. On a bright afternoon that felt like it had been waiting, I sold the old dining set and bought a narrower table that fit the room better, and the transaction felt like punctuation. That evening, I ate with a person who laughed at the same parts of a story and none of the same parts of a joke, and we both agreed that disagreement can be a kind of harmony. Later, walking home, I passed the hotel that had once been a footnote and noticed it had changed its sign, as if buildings also get tired of being reminders. I didn't slow down. There's a clean dignity in refusing to audition for nostalgia. If I'm honest, the victory was never about keeping more than my share or watching someone else learn the weight of their choices. It was about choosing not to be edited by someone who needed a plot twist. The ending I kept is quiet and therefore durable, a life that fits, a table that doesn't wobble, a calendar that belongs to me. When I turn out the lights, the house doesn't hold its breath. It doesn't have to.